Prologue. The impossible bird. In the deepest chamber of the ancient temple of Heliopolis, as the morning sun pierced through the narrow stone windows, the priests would gather to witness something impossible. They would wait in the sacred silence, watching the altar where the most precious artifact in Egypt lay gleaming in the golden light. A nest woven from cinnamon bark and myrrh, frankincense and cassia. And there, according to their most sacred texts, every 500 years, a bird unlike any other would appear, not born from an egg, not hatched from a mother's care, but arising spontaneously from the aromatic flames themselves. The phoenix, the Bennu, the bird that conquered death. This was not simply a creature of flesh and feather. This was a living paradox, a being that embodied the most profound mystery that has haunted humanity since consciousness first stirred in our ancient minds. How can something truly die and yet return? How can ending become beginning? How can destruction become creation? The phoenix was never just a bird. It was an answer to questions we barely knew how to ask. It was humanity's first attempt to imagine a death that was not final, a loss that was not permanent, a destruction that was, in fact, the most profound form of renewal. But where did this impossible creature truly come from? What ancient fears and hopes gave birth to a bird that could die and be reborn in fire? Tonight, we will trace this mythical being back to its origins, following a trail that leads us through the mystery religions of Egypt, the philosophical schools of Greece, the alchemical laboratories of medieval Europe, and into the very heart of the human soul's eternal struggle with mortality. This is not the story of a mythical creature. This is the story of an idea so powerful, so necessary to the human spirit, that it has survived for over 4,000 years, transforming and adapting to every culture it touches, yet never losing its essential promise. That what appears to be an ending might actually be the most magnificent beginning of all. We begin our journey not in the realm of fantasy, but in the sweltering heat of ancient Egypt, where the first phoenix was not a symbol, but a god. Chapter 1. The Sacred Heron of the Nile. The story of the phoenix begins not with fire, but with water. Not with death, but with creation itself. In the primordial darkness before the world existed, when there was nothing but the endless black waters of Nun, something stirred. According to the ancient Egyptian creation myth of Heliopolis, from these primordial waters arose the first solid ground, a small mound of earth called the Benben stone, and upon this stone, at the very moment of creation, landed the first living creature. A great heron with brilliant plumage and an otherworldly cry that split the cosmic silence. This was the Bennu bird, and its voice was the first sound in the universe. Its cry literally spoke creation into existence, calling forth light from darkness, order from chaos, time from eternity. The ancient texts tell us that when the Bennu opened its beak and sang, the world began. But the Bennu was not just present at creation, it was the heart of creation itself. For this sacred heron was the Ba, the soul of Ra, the sun god who would become the supreme deity of the Egyptian pantheon. Every dawn, as Ra's solar bark emerged from the underworld to illuminate the sky, it was the Bennu that flew ahead of it, herald of the light, harbinger of each new day's triumph over the darkness of night. In the sweltering workshops of Heliopolis, the city of the sun, the priests who served Ra developed an elaborate theology around their sacred bird. They identified the Bennu with the planet Venus, the brightest star in the sky, which appears to die in the western horizon only to be reborn in the east as the morning star. Like their god, like their sacred bird, Venus conquered death every single day. This was no mere nature worship. The Egyptians had recognized something profound about the natural world, that it was full of cycles within cycles within cycles. The daily journey of the sun, the monthly phases of the moon, the annual flooding of the Nile, the eternal progression of the stars. They lived in a universe that was constantly dying and being reborn, and the Bennu was their symbol for this fundamental truth. But the real breakthrough in the Bennu's mythology came when the priests began to connect this daily cycle to a much grander timeline. They taught that the Bennu didn't just herald each dawn, it appeared at the beginning of each great cosmic age. According to their calculations, which involved mathematics and astronomy of stunning sophistication, the Bennu would manifest in physical form only once every 1,460 years, marking the reset of the Sothic calendar when the star Sirius would once again rise with The sun at the perfect moment of the Nile's flood. This was the birth of cyclical time, the revolutionary idea that history itself was not a straight line leading toward an end, but a great circle, a cosmic wheel that turned through vast ages of death and rebirth. The Bennu was the keeper of this wheel, the divine force that ensured that every ending was also a beginning. In the sacred texts, they describe the Bennu's nest as being built from the most precious aromatics, cinnamon and myrrh, frankincense and cassia. These were not chosen randomly. These were the substances used in mummification, the spices that preserved the dead and prepared them for resurrection. The Bennu's nest was a tomb and a womb simultaneously, a place where death and birth were revealed to be the same sacred process. The priest taught that when the cosmic age grew old and corrupt, when the world had become weary and lost its way, the Bennu would appear. It would build its aromatic nest, set it aflame with the fire of the sun itself, and willingly burn to death in the sacred pyre. But from those same flames, from the ashes of its own destruction, the bird would emerge renewed, restored, ready to usher in a new age of gold. This was the first articulation of a concept that would revolutionize human thought. Redemptive death. The idea that destruction could be not just necessary, but holy. That some endings were so profound, so complete, that they cleared the way for something entirely new to be born. The physical reality behind this myth was likely the great grey heron, Ardea cinerea, a magnificent bird that still haunts the margins of the Nile. Standing nearly 4 feet tall, with a wingspan of 6 feet, the grey heron is a creature of profound dignity and mystery. It appears suddenly at the water's edge, motionless as a statue, then strikes with lightning speed. It can stand perfectly still for hours, then vanish in an instant, seeming to materialize and dematerialize like something from another world. But the Egyptian priests saw in this common heron something extraordinary. They saw a creature that lived between elements, equally at home on land, in water, or in the air. They saw a bird that was patient beyond human understanding, that could wait motionless for the perfect moment to strike. They saw a being that embodied the principle of perfect timing, of knowing exactly when to act and when to wait. Most importantly, they saw in the heron's behavior a mirror of their own deepest spiritual aspirations. The heron does not chase its prey. It waits. It allows the fish to come to it. It trusts in the perfect unfolding of time. For the Egyptian priests, this was a lesson in cosmic patience, in understanding that the greatest transformations cannot be rushed, that death and rebirth happen according to divine timing, not human impatience. As the centuries passed, the Bennu's story began to spread beyond the temples of Heliopolis. It traveled with merchants along the trade routes, with diplomats to foreign courts, with scholars to distant libraries. And as it traveled, it began to change. The sacred heron of the Nile was about to undergo its own metamorphosis, transforming from an Egyptian deity into a universal symbol that would speak to the deepest longings of the human heart. Chapter 2. From Heron to Phoenix. The Greek transformation. When the ancient Greeks first encountered the Egyptian Bennu through their extensive trade networks in the 7th century BC, they recognized something familiar, yet profoundly different. Here was a bird of rebirth, yes, but the Egyptians had imagined it as a heron, a creature of water and patience, appearing by the life-giving flood of the Nile. The Greeks, shaped by their own landscape of mountains and olive groves, of Mediterranean heat and sudden storms, envisioned something entirely different. They called it the phoenix, taking the name from their word for the deep purple-red color of Phoenician dye, the precious royal purple that came from the murex shells of the eastern Mediterranean. This was not just a change of name, it was a complete reimagining of the creature's essential nature. The first Greek to write about the phoenix was the historian Herodotus around 440 BC, and his account reveals the fascinating process of cultural translation. "I have not seen it myself," he admits with characteristic honesty, "except in a painting, for it is rare and visits the country only at intervals of 500 years. But the priests of Heliopolis had told him the story, and he faithfully recorded their account while adding his own Greek sensibilities. According to Herodotus, the phoenix was not a patient heron, but a magnificent bird of prey, large as an eagle, with feathers of gold and red that gleamed like flame itself. When its time came to die, it would fly to the temple of the sun god in Heliopolis, build a nest of aromatic wood and spices, and set itself on fire. From the ashes would emerge not the same bird reborn, but the phoenix's offspring, a new bird that would carry its parents' ashes back to the temple of the sun. This was a subtle but crucial change. The Egyptians had imagined literal resurrection, the same individual consciousness returning in the same body. The Greeks, with their more psychological approach to mythology, imagined something closer to reincarnation, the essential spirit passing into a new form, carrying forward the wisdom of the past, but embodying the possibilities of the future. The Greek transformation of the phoenix reflected their own deepest philosophical concerns. This was the culture that gave birth to philosophy itself, to the systematic questioning of existence, mortality, and meaning. For them, the phoenix became a symbol not just of renewal, but of transcendence, the possibility that consciousness itself could survive bodily death. The Stoic philosophers, in particular, embraced the phoenix as a symbol of their belief in cosmic cycles. They taught that the universe itself was like a great phoenix, periodically consuming itself in a cosmic fire called ekpyrosis, only to be reborn in a new and perfected form. The individual phoenix became a metaphor for the cosmic phoenix, and both reflected the human soul's journey through cycles of experience, death, and rebirth. But it was the Neoplatonic philosophers of the later classical period who developed the phoenix myth to its full philosophical potential. For them, the bird represented the soul's journey through incarnation. The soul, they taught, was like the phoenix, immortal, but periodically taking physical form. Death was simply the burning away of the material body, freeing the soul to choose its next incarnation. The Roman poet Ovid, writing in the 1st century AD, gave the phoenix myth its most influential literary form in his epic poem, Metamorphoses. His account is both beautiful and haunting. When 5 centuries of life have passed away, it builds a nest in the top of a palm tree on fragrant herbs and spices. There it sits and sings its death song as it dies. But straight from that dead body issues forth a new young phoenix, destined to live as many years. When strength and youth have ripened into power, it lifts the nest up from the lofty tree, its cradle and its parents' sepulchre, and bears it to the sun god's sacred city, where in his temple, it lays down its burden. Ovid's version introduced elements that would become central to the phoenix myth. The palm tree, sacred to Apollo, god of the sun and prophecy. The beautiful death song, and most importantly, the idea that the phoenix voluntarily chooses its own death as an act of renewal rather than resignation. The Greeks also added a crucial psychological dimension to the myth. They connected the phoenix to the human experience of trauma and recovery. Just as the phoenix had to endure the agony of burning alive before it could be reborn, human beings had to endure suffering, loss, and psychological death before they could experience true transformation. This insight would prove prophetic. The phoenix was becoming more than a myth about a magical bird. It was becoming a template for understanding the most profound transformations in human life. It was teaching that some changes are so fundamental that they require the complete destruction of who you were before in order to become who you are meant to be. The Greek mystery religions, particularly those centered around Dionysus and Orpheus, adopted the phoenix as a symbol of initiation. Their secret ceremonies often involved symbolic death and rebirth, teaching initiates that true wisdom could only come through the willingness to let your old self die completely. But perhaps the most significant Greek addition to the phoenix myth was the concept of the eternal return made personal. While the Egyptians had seen the Bennu as marking cosmic ages, the Greeks began to see the phoenix as a symbol of individual spiritual development. Each person, they taught, was on their own phoenix journey, cycling through experiences of death and rebirth throughout their lifetime. They recognized that human beings don't just die once, we die many times throughout our lives. The death of childhood, the death of innocence, the death of old dreams, the death of relationships, the death of careers, the death of health, the death of youth. Each of these deaths, if approached with the wisdom of the phoenix, could become an opportunity for rebirth into something greater. By the end of the classical period, the phoenix had evolved from an Egyptian deity into a universal symbol of transformation. It had crossed cultural boundaries, adapted to new languages and mythologies, and most importantly, it had begun to speak to something essential in the human experience, our need to believe that endings can become beginnings. that loss can become renewal, that death can become rebirth. But the phoenix's greatest transformation was yet to come. It was about to encounter a young religion born in the deserts of Palestine, a faith that would see in this ancient bird a perfect symbol for its own revolutionary message about death, resurrection, and eternal life. Chapter 3: The Christian Phoenix, Symbol of Resurrection. When the early Christian fathers first encountered the phoenix myth in the classical literature of their time, they experienced what could only be called divine recognition. Here was a pagan symbol that seemed to perfectly embody the central mystery of their faith: resurrection from death. But unlike the philosophers who saw the phoenix as a metaphor, the Christians believed they had witnessed actual resurrection in the person of Jesus Christ. The phoenix became proof that even pagan wisdom had been preparing the world for the Christian revelation. The first Christian writer to embrace the phoenix was Clement of Rome, writing around 96 AD in his first letter to the Corinthians. His account is remarkable for its detailed description and its absolute confidence in the bird's existence. Let us consider that wonderful sign which takes place in eastern lands, that is, in Arabia and the countries round about. There is a certain bird which is called a phoenix. This is the only one of its kind and lives 500 years. And when the time of its dissolution draws near that it must die, it builds itself a nest of frankincense and myrrh and other spices, into which, when the time is fulfilled, it enters and dies. But as the flesh decays, a certain kind of worm is produced, which, being nourished by the juices of the dead bird, brings forth feathers. Then, when it has acquired strength, it takes up that nest in which are the bones of its parent, and bearing these it passes from the land of Arabia into Egypt, to the city called Heliopolis. What's fascinating about Clement's account is that he presents the phoenix not as a myth or allegory, but as a factual demonstration of God's power. He continues, "And flying in open day in the sight of all men, it places them on the altar of the sun, and having done this, hastens back to its former abode. The priests then inspect the registers of the dates, and find that it has returned exactly as the 500th year was completed." For Clement and the early church fathers who followed him, the phoenix was divine pedagogy, God's way of teaching pagan cultures about resurrection, so they would be prepared to understand the greater truth of Christ's victory over death. The bird's self-immolation paralleled Christ's willing sacrifice on the cross, while its emergence from the ashes prefigured the resurrection on Easter morning. But the Christian transformation of the phoenix myth went far deeper than simple allegory. The early church was struggling to explain to both Jews and Gentiles how death could be conquered, how mortality could be transformed into immortality, how the human body could be both physical and eternal. The phoenix provided a perfect model for understanding the resurrected body, the same yet transformed, material yet incorruptible, individual yet universal. The Desert Fathers, those remarkable Christian mystics who retreated to the Egyptian desert in the 3rd and 4th centuries, developed the phoenix symbolism in the direction of spiritual transformation. For them, the bird represented the soul's journey through what they called the dark night of the soul, the necessary spiritual death that preceded mystical union with God. St. John Chrysostom, the golden-tongued preacher of Constantinople, used the phoenix in his Easter sermons to explain the mystery of the resurrection. He taught that just as the phoenix willingly entered the flames, Christ willingly entered death. Just as the phoenix was not conquered by fire but transformed by it, Christ was not conquered by death, but transformed it into the gateway to eternal life. The medieval Christian bestiary writers, those encyclopedists of symbolic animal lore, developed elaborate allegorical interpretations of every aspect of the phoenix myth. The bird's nest of aromatic spices represented the prayers and good works of the faithful. The fire represented divine love, which burns away sin but does not destroy the soul. The 3 days between death and resurrection, an element added by Christian writers, directly paralleled Christ's time in the tomb, but perhaps the most profound Christian development of the phoenix myth was its connection to the sacrament of baptism. The early church taught that baptism was a form of death and resurrection. The old self died in the water, and the new self was born in Christ. The phoenix became the perfect symbol for this transformation, representing every Christian's journey from spiritual death to spiritual life. St. Ambrose of Milan, one of the great theologians of the 4th century, wrote, Is there anyone who does not know that the phoenix, when it feels itself growing old, makes itself a funeral pyre of aromatic wood and spices, and then leaps into the flames, and is thus renewed by its own death? And it is a lesson for us that we too should be renewed by death, that we should not fear the death of the body, since it may prove to be the cause of a better life. The Christian phoenix also became associated with martyrdom. The early church taught that martyrs were like the phoenix. They willingly entered the flames of persecution and were transformed by their suffering into something glorious. The arena became their nest of spices, their torturers became the instruments of their transformation, and their deaths became the birth of their eternal life. During the medieval period, the phoenix became one of the most popular Christian symbols, appearing in illuminated manuscripts, cathedral carvings, and church frescoes throughout Europe. It was particularly associated with Easter, representing not just Christ's resurrection, but the resurrection promised to all believers. The medieval mystics, particularly Meister Eckhart and his followers, developed the phoenix symbolism in the direction of what they called dying before death, the mystical experience of ego death that allowed the soul to be reborn in divine consciousness. For them, every moment offered the opportunity to be like the phoenix, to voluntarily release attachment to the old self and be reborn in love. But the Christian phoenix was not just about death and resurrection, it was about transformation. The medieval alchemists, working within a broadly Christian framework, saw the phoenix as the perfect symbol for their work of spiritual and material transformation. The bird's death in fire represented the breaking down of base matter, or base consciousness, while its resurrection represented the emergence of gold, or enlightened awareness. By the end of the medieval period, the phoenix had become thoroughly Christianized, but in the process, it had also become universalized. The symbol now spoke not just to Christians, but to anyone who had experienced the mystery of transformation through suffering, the possibility of new life emerging from apparent death, the hope that endings could become beginnings. The Christian phoenix had taught the world that resurrection was not just a one-time miracle, but an ongoing possibility, available to every human soul willing to undergo the necessary death of the ego, the voluntary surrender of the old self in service of the new. It had transformed from a mythical bird into a spiritual technology, a map for navigating the most profound transformations of human existence. But the phoenix was about to undergo its own transformation once again, as the medieval world gave way to the Renaissance, and Christian allegory evolved into psychological insight. Chapter 4: Alchemical Fire, the Phoenix in Medieval Mysticism, in the shadowy laboratories of medieval Europe, where glass vessels bubbled over carefully tended fires, and scholars worked by candlelight translating ancient texts. The phoenix underwent perhaps its most profound transformation. The alchemists, those predecessors of both modern chemistry and psychology, saw in the mythical bird not just a religious symbol, but a precise formula for transformation itself. The word alchemy comes from the Arabic alchemia, itself derived from the ancient Greek chemeia, possibly referring to the black earth of Egypt where the art first flourished. But for the medieval alchemists, their work was never just about transforming lead into gold. It was about transforming the human soul from its base, leaden state into spiritual gold, and the phoenix became their master symbol for this great work. In the hermetic traditions that flourished in medieval Europe, the phoenix represented what they called the philosophical death, the necessary dissolution of the old self that had to occur before the new, perfected self could emerge. The alchemical texts speak of this process in language that is both mystical and practical, poetic and precise. The great alchemical treatise known as the Aurora Consurgens, attributed to Thomas Aquinas himself, describes the phoenix process in vivid detail. The phoenix burns itself to ashes in the fire of its own making, and from these ashes arises the new bird, more beautiful than before. So too must the seeker burn away all that is false and impure in the fire of divine love, that the true self might emerge, clothed in the golden light of wisdom. The alchemists developed an elaborate symbolic language around the phoenix, each element of the myth corresponding to a specific stage in the transformative process. The aromatic wood of the nest represented the prepared mind, gathered through study and contemplation. The fire represented the intense spiritual practices, meditation, prayer, ritual that would burn away the ego's attachments. The ashes represented the dark night of the soul, the period of apparent death and dissolution, and the emerging bird represented the philosopher's stone, the transformed consciousness capable of transmuting everything it touched. But the alchemical phoenix was not just symbolic, it was operational. The medieval alchemists created actual laboratory procedures based on the phoenix myth, repeatedly dissolving and reconstituting their materials in a process they called solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. They would take a substance, break it down into its constituent elements through fire and acid, then carefully recombine those elements into a new, purified form. This process of dissolution and reconstitution became the foundation of what we now recognize as the scientific method, the systematic breaking down of complex phenomena into their component parts and then rebuilding our understanding from the ground up. The alchemists were literally practicing resurrection in their laboratories, learning through hands-on experimentation how death and rebirth actually worked at the molecular level. The most famous alchemical phoenix text is the chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, published in 1616 and attributed to the mysterious figure who founded the Rosicrucian movement. In this allegorical novel, the protagonist undergoes a series of initiations that culminate in his own phoenix-like death and resurrection. The story is both a spiritual autobiography and a precise manual for inner transformation. The text describes 7 days of initiation, each corresponding to a stage in the alchemical process. On the 6th day, the protagonist witnesses the ritual death and resurrection of a royal couple, representing the sacred marriage of opposites within the soul. The ceremony takes place in a tower with 7 stories, each representing a level of consciousness, and the actual resurrection occurs through the application of what the text calls the fire of love. Medieval alchemists also connected the phoenix to the notion of the elixir of life, the legendary substance that could confer immortality. But their understanding of immortality was sophisticated and psychological. They weren't necessarily seeking to live forever in physical form, but rather to achieve a state of consciousness that transcended the ordinary cycles of psychological death and rebirth. The great Arab alchemist Jabir ibn Hayyan, working in the 8th century, wrote, "The phoenix teaches us that true immortality is not the avoidance of death, but the mastery of death. When one learns to die consciously, one learns to live consciously. When one learns to surrender the ego voluntarily, one discovers the self that cannot die." This insight was developed further by the medieval Christian alchemists, who saw the phoenix as representing what they called the resurrection body, not the physical body that dies and decays, but a subtle body of light that emerges through spiritual practice. This resurrection body was understood to be both individual and universal, both human and divine, both temporal and eternal. The alchemical phoenix also became associated with the concept of the philosopher's stone, the legendary substance that could transmute base metals into gold and grant immortality to its possessor. But the more sophisticated alchemists understood that the philosopher's stone was not a physical object, but a state of consciousness, the awakened awareness that could transform everything it encountered. The 16th century alchemist Paracelsus wrote, "The phoenix stone is not found in nature, but must be created through art. Yet this art is not the work of the hands, but the work of the heart." The true alchemist does not seek to create the stone, but to become the stone. And when one becomes the stone, one discovers that one has always been the stone. For the phoenix nature is the deepest truth of the human soul. This teaching points to one of the most profound insights of alchemical phoenix symbolism, the recognition that transformation is not something that happens to us from outside, but something that we discover was always already present within us. The phoenix doesn't become something new, it reveals what it always was beneath the temporary clothing of its mortal form. The medieval alchemists also developed the phoenix symbolism in the direction of what they called sacred timing. They taught that transformation couldn't be forced or rushed, but had to unfold according to natural rhythms and cosmic cycles. Just as the phoenix appeared only once every 500 years, the moment of inner transformation could not be predicted or controlled, it could only be prepared for and recognized when it arrived. This led to the development of elaborate systems of correspondences between inner transformation and outer cycles, the phases of the moon, the movements of the planets, the changing of the seasons. The alchemical phoenix became a symbol not just of personal transformation, but of the human soul's relationship to the larger cosmos. The recognition that individual awakening was part of a vast cosmic process of evolution and renewal. By the end of the medieval period, the alchemical tradition had transformed the phoenix from a mythological bird into something like a spiritual technology, a precise map of consciousness that could guide seekers through the necessary stages of death and rebirth. The symbol had become operational, practical, and deeply personal, but the phoenix was about to undergo another metamorphosis as the medieval world gave way to the Renaissance, and the language of alchemy evolved into the language of art, literature, and eventually psychology. The bird of fire was preparing to spread its wings into new realms of human understanding. Chapter 5: Renaissance Rebirth, Art, Literature, and Personal Transformation. The Renaissance, that great cultural phoenix that emerged from the ashes of medieval Europe, found in the ancient bird a perfect symbol for its own revolutionary spirit. This was an age obsessed with rebirth. The rebirth of classical learning, the rebirth of artistic expression, the rebirth of human dignity and potential. The phoenix became the unofficial mascot of an entire civilization that believed it was rising from the Dark Ages into a new golden age of enlightenment. In the workshops of Florence, Venice, and Rome, Renaissance artists transformed the phoenix from a religious symbol into a celebration of human creativity and potential. The bird appeared in frescoes and paintings, in sculptures and tapestries, but now it represented not just spiritual resurrection, but the power of the human imagination to create new worlds from the ashes of the old. Leonardo da Vinci, that supreme Renaissance genius, was fascinated by the phoenix myth and filled his notebooks with sketches of the mythical bird. But Leonardo's phoenix was different from its medieval predecessors. It was anatomically precise, scientifically plausible, a creature that could actually exist in the natural world. His drawings show a magnificent bird with the body structure of an eagle, the plumage of a peacock, and wings designed according to his studies of flight mechanics. Leonardo wrote in his notebooks, "The phoenix teaches us that death and birth are not opposites, but collaborators. In nature, nothing is ever truly destroyed. It is only transformed. The artist is like the phoenix, taking the dead materials of pigment and canvas, wood and stone, and breathing new life into them through the fire of imagination." This insight that creativity itself was a form of resurrection became central to Renaissance thinking about art and human potential. The Renaissance artists saw themselves as phoenix-like figures, capable of taking the dead remnants of classical culture and transforming them into something vibrantly alive and contemporary. Botticelli's famous painting, The Birth of Venus, can be read as a phoenix allegory, showing the goddess of love and beauty emerging from the foam of the sea like the phoenix from its ashes. The shell that carries Venus is reminiscent of the aromatic nest, and her flowing hair suggests the flames of transformation. The painting celebrates not just the birth of beauty, but the eternal human capacity for renewal and rebirth. The Renaissance poets, particularly those working in the tradition of Petrarch, used the phoenix as a symbol for the transformative power of love. In their sonnets and epic poems, the lover undergoes a phoenix-like death and resurrection through the experience of deep passion. Love burns away the old self and creates a new being, more beautiful and capable than before. The English Renaissance poet Edmund Spenser, in his epic The Faerie Queene, created one of the most beautiful phoenix passages in all of literature. "So every spirit, as it is most pure, and hath in it the more of heavenly light, so it the fairer body doth procure to habit in, and it more fairly dight with cheerful grace and amiable sight. For of the soul the body form doth take, for soul is form, and doth the body make." But it was Shakespeare who gave the Renaissance phoenix its most psychologically sophisticated treatment in his mysterious poem, The Phoenix and the Turtle. This dense, symbolic work explores the death of ideal love and its transformation into something beyond individual existence. So they loved, as love in twain, had the essence but in one. Two distincts, division none. Number there in love was slain. Hearts remote, yet not asunder. Distance, and no space was seen, twixt the turtle and his queen, but in them it were a wonder. Shakespeare's phoenix represents the paradox of love that transcends individual identity. two beings so united that they become one, yet in becoming one, they transcend both. The poem ends with the phoenix and the turtle dying together and being reborn as a unified essence that is neither one nor two, but something entirely new. The Renaissance also saw the emergence of the phoenix as a political symbol. Various European monarchs adopted the bird as their personal emblem, representing the idea that their kingdoms could be renewed and reformed through enlightened leadership. Queen Elizabeth I of England was particularly associated with phoenix symbolism, representing the renewal of England's power and cultural flowering after the turbulent reigns of her predecessors. The great Renaissance philosopher Pico della Mirandola, in his famous Oration on the Dignity of Man, used phoenix-like imagery to describe human potential. We have made you neither of heaven nor of earth, neither mortal nor immortal, so that with freedom of choice and with honor, as though the maker and moulder of yourself, you may fashion yourself in whatever shape you shall prefer. This idea that human beings are essentially phoenix-like creatures, capable of dying to their old selves and being reborn as something greater, became central to Renaissance humanism. Unlike medieval Christianity, which emphasized human sinfulness and dependence on divine grace, Renaissance humanism celebrated the human capacity for self-transformation and renewal. The Renaissance alchemists, building on their medieval predecessors, developed even more sophisticated phoenix symbolism. The great alchemist and physician Philippus Aureolus Paracelsus taught that the human body itself was like a phoenix, constantly dying and being reborn at the cellular level. He developed medical treatments based on the principle of controlled destruction, using carefully administered poisons to burn away disease and allow healthy tissue to regenerate. This medical phoenix principle that sometimes you have to destroy in order to heal became foundational to Renaissance medicine and later to modern chemotherapy and radiation treatments. The phoenix had taught doctors that healing and hurting could be the same process, depending on intention and skill. The Renaissance also saw the birth of phoenix symbolism in personal psychology. The great essayist Michel de Montaigne wrote extensively about his own experiences of psychological death and rebirth, describing how various life crises had forced him to abandon old identities and discover new aspects of himself. His essays are essentially a phoenix autobiography, chronicling the multiple deaths and rebirths of a single human consciousness over the course of a lifetime. Montaigne wrote, "I am not teaching, I am recounting. I am describing not being but passage. Not the passage from one age to another, but from day to day, from minute to minute. My history needs to be adapted to the present moment. I may presently change not only by chance, but also by intention. This insight that personal identity is not fixed, but constantly dying and being reborn was revolutionary for its time and laid the groundwork for modern psychological understanding of personality, development and change, the Renaissance. Phoenix also became associated with the idea of cultural renewal. The period's scholars and artists saw themselves as participating in a great cultural phoenix event, the death of medieval darkness and the birth of a new age of light. This wasn't just individual transformation, but collective transformation, an entire civilization dying to its old forms and being reborn in new ones. By the end of the Renaissance, the phoenix had evolved from a mythological creature into a comprehensive symbol system for understanding transformation at every level: personal, artistic, political, cultural, and spiritual. It had become a technology of renewal, a map for navigating the inevitable deaths and rebirths that mark any life fully lived. But the phoenix was about to encounter the modern world, where its ancient wisdom would be tested against new forms of death and new possibilities for rebirth that even the wisest Renaissance thinkers could never have imagined. Chapter 6. The Romantic Phoenix, Revolution and Individual Renewal. The 18th and 19th centuries brought upheavals that would have been unimaginable to earlier ages. Political revolutions toppled ancient monarchies. Industrial transformation destroyed traditional ways of life overnight, and scientific discoveries shattered comfortable assumptions about humanity's place in the cosmos. In this age of revolutionary change, the phoenix found new relevance as a symbol not just of personal transformation, but of historical and social renewal. The American Revolution adopted the phoenix as one of its unofficial symbols, appearing on colonial currency and in revolutionary pamphlets. The founders saw their new nation as rising phoenix-like from the ashes of British colonial rule. Thomas Paine, in his influential pamphlet Common Sense, wrote, "The old world is overrun with oppression. Freedom hath been hunted round the globe. Asia and Africa have long expelled her. Europe regards her like a stranger, and England hath given her warning to depart. Oh, receive the fugitive, and prepare in time an asylum for mankind." The image is clearly phoenix-like, the old world dying in the flames of its own corruption, and a new world of freedom being born from its ashes. The American founders believed they were witnessing and participating in a historical phoenix moment. The death of monarchy and the birth of democracy, the end of aristocracy and the beginning of equality. The French Revolution took this phoenix symbolism even further. The revolutionaries explicitly adopted the bird as a symbol of national renewal, appearing on revolutionary coins and banners. They saw themselves as burning away not just a political system, but an entire way of life, the feudal world of hierarchy and tradition, to make way for a society based on liberty, equality, and fraternity. But the French Revolution also revealed the shadow side of phoenix symbolism. The Reign of Terror showed that the fire of renewal could become the fire of destruction, that the line between constructive death and mere annihilation was thinner than anyone had imagined. The guillotine became a dark parody of the phoenix's fire, promising regeneration through violence but delivering only more violence. It was the Romantic poets and philosophers who rescued the phoenix from its association with political violence and restored it to its proper domain, the transformation of human consciousness. For the Romantics, the phoenix became the ultimate symbol of the individual soul's capacity for renewal through suffering, love, and artistic creation. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, that great romantic visionary, wrote in his notebooks, "The phoenix is the soul's own symbol. Every true experience of beauty, of love, of suffering, of joy, burns away some portion of our old selves and creates us anew. We are all constantly dying and being reborn, but we notice it only in the great moments when the fire burns bright enough to see by." Percy Bysshe Shelley, the radical poet and philosopher, used phoenix imagery throughout his work to represent both personal and social transformation. In his epic poem Prometheus Unbound, the mythical titan who stole fire from the gods becomes a phoenix-like figure, suffering eternal torment for his gift to humanity, but ultimately being reborn as the liberator of human potential. Shelley's wife, Mary Shelley, explored the darker implications of phoenix symbolism in her novel Frankenstein. The scientist Victor Frankenstein attempts to play phoenix to his own creation, bringing life from death through the application of scientific fire. But Mary Shelley's novel reveals what happens when phoenix power is used without phoenix wisdom. The result is not renewal, but monstrosity, not rebirth, but an abomination. The German Romantic philosophers, particularly Friedrich Schelling and G.W.F. Hegel, developed sophisticated philosophical frameworks around phoenix-like processes. Hegel's famous dialectical method, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, is essentially a phoenix process applied to ideas. Each stage of thought must die to give birth to the next stage, and the final synthesis emerges from the ashes of the contradictions that preceded it. Hegel wrote, "The phoenix only consumes itself, but from its ashes emerges the new, rejuvenated, fresh life. Spirit, however, not merely emerges rejuvenated from the ashes of its previous form, it comes forth exalted, glorified, a purer spirit." This philosophical phoenix became central to 19th century understanding of historical progress. Instead of seeing history as a mere sequence of events, thinkers began to understand it as a phoenix-like process of dialectical transformation, with each age dying to give birth to the next, more advanced stage of human development. The Romantic movement also saw the emergence of phoenix symbolism in personal psychology and autobiography. The great Romantic memoir writers, Rousseau, Wordsworth, De Quincey, all described their lives in phoenix-like terms, as a series of deaths and rebirths through which they discovered their authentic selves. William Wordsworth, in his autobiographical poem The Prelude, describes how his encounter with the beauty of nature in childhood created a phoenix-like transformation of consciousness. There are in our existence spots of time that with distinct preeminence retain a renovating virtue, whence, depressed by false opinion and contentious thought, or aught of heavier or more deadly weight, in trivial occupations and the round of ordinary, intercourse, our minds are nourished and invisibly repaired. This insight that certain moments have renovating virtue, the power to burn away false consciousness and restore authentic awareness, became central to Romantic understanding of personal development. The Romantics also connected Phoenix symbolism to their understanding of artistic creation. For them, every true work of art was born from a phoenix-like process in which the artist's ordinary consciousness had to die in order for the creative consciousness to be born. The artist was literally reborn through the creative process, emerging from each work transformed and renewed. John Keats, in his letters, described this process. A poet is the most unpoetical of anything in existence. Because he has no identity, he is continually in for and filling some other body. The sun, the moon, the sea and men and women who are creatures of impulse are poetical and have about them an unchangeable attribute. The poet has none. No identity. He is certainly the most unpoetical of all God's creatures. This negative capability, as Keats called it, is essentially a phoenix quality, the ability to die to one's own identity in order to be reborn in the identity of whatever one is. Creating or experiencing the Industrial Revolution brought new forms of death and rebirth that the Romantics saw in phoenix-like terms. Traditional crafts died to give birth to mass production. Rural communities died to give birth to industrial cities. Agricultural societies died to give birth to industrial nations. The Romantics were among the first to recognize that they were living through a civilizational phoenix moment, but many of them were also deeply troubled by the price of this transformation. William Blake, in his prophetic books, depicted the Industrial Revolution as a false phoenix, a death that produced not renewal but spiritual desolation. His famous poem, Jerusalem, is a lament for the phoenix transformation that England had failed to achieve. And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green? And was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic mills? Blake saw the industrial mills as false phoenix fires that burned away England's green and pleasant land, but failed to create the spiritual Jerusalem that should have emerged from the ashes. By the end of the Romantic period, the phoenix had evolved from a symbol of individual spiritual transformation into a comprehensive framework for understanding all forms of change, personal, artistic, social, and historical. The Romantics had taught the world to see phoenix processes everywhere, in the development of consciousness, in the creation of art, in the evolution of society, in the progress of history itself. But the phoenix was about to face its greatest challenge yet, as the 20th century brought forms of death and destruction that seemed to offer no possibility of renewal, no promise of rebirth from the ashes. The ancient bird of resurrection was about to be tested by the modern world's capacity for seemingly meaningless annihilation. Chapter 7. Phoenix in the Modern Crucible. Wars, Psychology, and Collective Trauma. The 20th century confronted humanity with forms of death that seemed to offer no possibility of renewal. 2 world wars, the Holocaust, nuclear weapons, environmental destruction. These were not the clean, transformative fires of the Phoenix myth, but apocalyptic conflagrations that seemed to promise only annihilation. Yet even in the darkest moments of the modern age, the Phoenix symbol proved its enduring power, adapting to help humans make meaning from seemingly meaningless suffering. The Great War of 1914-1918 shattered the 19th century's optimistic faith in progress and renewal. An entire generation of young men died in the trenches of France and Belgium, and the survivors emerged not renewed, but shattered, suffering from what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder. The old Phoenix narratives, death, leading to glorious rebirth, seemed like cruel mockeries in the face of such mechanized slaughter. Yet it was precisely in this context that some of the most profound Phoenix insights emerged. The war poets, Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, Robert Graves, wrote about the necessity of dying to innocence in order to be born into truth. Their poetry was itself a phoenix process, transforming the raw material of trauma into art that could help others navigate similar transformations. Wilfred Owen, in his poem Dulce et decorum est, performed a phoenix-like transformation on the classical ideal of noble death in battle. If you could hear At every jolt, the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cut-off vial, incurable sores on innocent tongues. My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory. The old lie, dulciet decorum est pro patria mori. Owen burns away the old lie of glorious death to reveal the truth of modern warfare. And from this destruction emerges a new form of honor, the honor of witnessing and speaking truth about suffering. The Russian Revolution of 1917 represented one of history's most dramatic attempts at collective phoenix transformation, the deliberate destruction of an entire social order to make way for something completely new. The Bolsheviks explicitly used phoenix imagery, promising that the old world of capitalism and monarchy would burn away to reveal the new world of socialism and equality. But the Russian Revolution also revealed the shadow side of phoenix ideology when applied to politics. The millions who died in the purges, the famines, the gulags, these were sacrificed on the altar of a phoenix transformation that never came. The revolution taught the world that political phoenix processes could become simply destructive rather than transformative, consuming everything without creating anything genuinely new. The development of psychoanalysis in the early 20th century gave the phoenix symbol new scientific credibility. Sigmund Freud's understanding of psychological development as a series of deaths and rebirths, the death of infantile narcissism, the death of the Oedipal complex, the death of adolescent omnipotence, was essentially a phoenix model of human maturation. But it was Carl Gustav Jung who developed the most sophisticated modern understanding of phoenix symbolism. Jung saw the phoenix as representing what he called the death-rebirth archetype, one of the fundamental patterns of human psychological development. In his therapeutic work, Jung helped patients recognize that their psychological crises were often phoenix moments, apparent breakdowns that were actually breakthroughs to higher levels of integration and consciousness. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, and who you truly are can only be discovered by allowing who you think you are to die. This death is not metaphorical. It is a real psychological death, as real as physical death. But it leads not to extinction, but to rebirth into your authentic self." Jung's concept of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming a whole, integrated person, is essentially a series of phoenix transformations. Each stage of development requires the death of the previous stage's ego identity and the birth of a more mature and inclusive sense of self. The Holocaust presented the phoenix symbol with its ultimate test. Here was death on an industrial scale, suffering so immense and apparently meaningless that it seemed to negate any possibility of redemption or renewal. How could phoenix wisdom address systematic genocide, the calculated attempt to erase entire peoples from the earth? The survivors who wrote about their experiences, Viktor Frankl, Primo Levi, Elie Wiesel, often used phoenix-like imagery to describe their transformations. They had died to their old selves in the camps and been reborn as witnesses, as bearers of testimony, as living reminders of both human evil and human resilience. Viktor Frankl, in his book Man's Search for Meaning, wrote, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And there were always choices to make. Every day, every hour, offered the opportunity to make a decision which determined whether you would or would not submit to those powers which threatened to rob you of your very self, your inner freedom." Frankl's insight that even in the most extreme circumstances, humans retain the power to choose their response is fundamentally phoenix-like. The external self may be completely destroyed, but something essential can survive and be reborn in new form. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 created a new kind of phoenix challenge. Nuclear weapons represented the possibility of death without rebirth, annihilation without renewal, endings without beginnings. The atomic age forced humanity to confront the possibility that we had created fires that could burn everything to ashes without creating anything new. Yet even here, phoenix symbolism proved relevant. The survivors of the atomic bombings, the Hibakusha, often described their experiences in phoenix-like terms. They had been burned in nuclear fire and reborn as witnesses, as warnings, as living symbols of both human destructiveness and the possibility of choosing differently. The environmental movement of the late 20th century adopted phoenix symbolism to describe the planet's potential for renewal after ecological destruction. The first Earth Day in 1970 was explicitly framed as a phoenix moment, humanity waking up to the death it had inflicted on the natural world and choosing to be reborn as stewards rather than destroyers of the earth. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, the book that launched the modern environmental movement, uses phoenix-like imagery throughout. Carson describes the death of landscapes poisoned by pesticides, but also points toward the possibility of renewal through wiser choices. Her book itself was a phoenix work, emerging from the ashes of her own battle with cancer to transform public consciousness about humanity's relationship with nature. The women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 70s also adopted phoenix symbolism, seeing feminism as a collective phoenix process in which women were dying to traditional gender roles and being reborn as full human beings with unlimited potential. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique described the problem that has no name, the spiritual death that many women experienced in purely domestic roles, and pointed toward rebirth through expanded opportunities and choices. The civil rights movement used phoenix imagery to describe the transformation of American society from a system based on racial oppression to one based on equality and justice. Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous "I Have a Dream" speech is structured like a phoenix narrative, describing the death of the old system of segregation and the birth of a new America, where people would be judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. King explicitly used phoenix imagery in his writing. We must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And sometimes, before justice can be born, injustice must die. And the death of injustice can be as painful as any other death. But from its ashes will rise the new South, the new America, the beloved community. By the end of the 20th century, the phoenix had proven its relevance to every form of transformation that human beings could experience: personal, psychological, social, political, environmental, and spiritual. It had survived the test of modernity, adapting its ancient wisdom to address contemporary challenges while maintaining its essential promise that endings can become beginnings, that death can become rebirth, that what appears to be destruction can actually be the most profound form of renewal. Chapter 8: The Contemporary Phoenix, Digital Death and Virtual Rebirth in Our Hyper-Connected 21st Century. The phoenix has found new incarnations that the ancient Egyptian priests could never have imagined. We live in an age of digital death and virtual rebirth, where entire identities can be deleted with the click of a button and recreated with equal ease. The phoenix symbol has adapted to help us navigate transformations that happen not over centuries or even years, but in microseconds, at the speed of light through fiber optic cables. The dot-com crash of 2000 was perhaps the first major phoenix event of the digital age. Billions of dollars in market value evaporated overnight. Thousands of companies disappeared. Entire business models became extinct. Yet from this digital conflagration emerged the technologies that now dominate our world. Google, Facebook, Amazon, all rising phoenix-like from the ashes of the first internet boom. Entrepreneurs began to speak explicitly in phoenix terms about failure as a feature, failing fast, and pivoting, all euphemisms for the kind of rapid death and rebirth cycles that characterize innovation in the digital economy. Silicon Valley developed an entire culture around phoenix principles, celebrating failure as a necessary prelude to success, teaching that the only real failure was the failure to learn from failure. Reid Hoffman, founder of LinkedIn, articulated this philosophy. Starting a company is like jumping off a cliff and assembling a plane on the way down. You will crash, you will burn, but if you learn how to crash well, you can use the wreckage to build something better. Every successful entrepreneur is really a phoenix, someone who has learned how to die professionally and be reborn with more wisdom. Social media created new forms of phoenix experience that operate at both individual and collective levels. People began curating online personas that could be regularly killed off and reborn, changing profile pictures, reinventing personal brands, ghosting old relationships to make space for new ones. The average Facebook user, researchers discovered, effectively becomes a different person every few years. with few traces of their earlier online selves remaining visible. But social media also created collective phoenix moments that operate at unprecedented speed and scale. Viral movements emerge from nowhere, burn across the global consciousness, and disappear just as quickly, leaving transformed landscapes in their wake. The Arab Spring, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, climate strike, all followed phoenix-like patterns of spontaneous emergence, rapid spread, apparent death, and unexpected resurrection in new forms. The 2008 financial crisis represented another kind of collective phoenix moment. The old financial system, based on unlimited growth, speculative bubbles, and too-big-to-fail institutions, effectively died in September 2008. From its ashes emerged new forms of economic organization: the sharing economy, cryptocurrency, sustainable finance, universal basic income experiments. The crisis burned away assumptions about capitalism that had seemed permanent and created space for economic models that had been unthinkable just years before. The rise of artificial intelligence has created new philosophical questions about phoenix-like transformation. If consciousness can be uploaded, downloaded, backed up, and restored, what does it mean to die and be reborn? AI researchers speak about model death, the process of training AI systems by repeatedly destroying and recreating their neural networks. As a form of accelerated evolution, each death allows the system to be reborn with greater capabilities. Some transhumanist thinkers have embraced the phoenix as the ultimate symbol of their project. They envision a future where biological death becomes optional, where consciousness can be transferred between bodies, where the human species itself undergoes phoenix-like transformation into something post-human. Ray Kurzweil, the futurist and Google executive, has written, "We are approaching a phoenix moment for our species, the death of Homo sapiens, and the birth of something unprecedented. But unlike the mythical bird, we will be conscious participants in our own rebirth." The climate crisis has generated perhaps the most urgent contemporary phoenix narrative. Climate activists and scientists speak about the need for civilization to undergo rapid fundamental transformation, dying to fossil fuel dependence and being reborn as a sustainable species. The alternative, they warn, is not phoenix-like renewal, but simple extinction. Greta Thunberg, the young climate activist, articulated this phoenix challenge in her speech to the United Nations. "You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. Yet I am one of the lucky ones. People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction. And all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? The eyes of all future generations are upon us. And if you choose to fail us, I say, we will never forgive you." Thunberg's message is essentially phoenix-like. The old world is dying, and we can choose to participate consciously in the birth of a new world, or we can cling to the dying world and be consumed by its flames. The COVID-19 pandemic created a global phoenix moment that affected virtually every human being on the planet simultaneously. Within weeks, the familiar world of 2019, with its patterns of work, travel, social interaction, and economic activity, effectively died. From its ashes emerged new ways of living, working, learning, and relating to each other that would have been unimaginable just months before. Remote work, online education, telemedicine, virtual reality socializing, contactless commerce, all of these innovations had existed before the pandemic, but were suddenly adopted at massive scale out of necessity. The pandemic forced a collective, death and rebirth experience that compressed what might have been decades of gradual change into a few months of radical transformation. Many people describe their pandemic experience in explicitly phoenix-like terms. They spoke of the death of their old selves, the commuter, the office worker, the social butterfly, the globe-trotting traveler, and the birth of new identities adapted to pandemic realities. The sourdough baker, the Zoom master, the homeschool teacher, the neighborhood walker. Psychologists began to document what they called post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where people emerge from traumatic experiences not just healed, but actually stronger and more resilient than before. This is essentially phoenix psychology, the recognition that some forms of suffering can be transformative rather than merely destructive. Dr. Richard Tedeschi, who coined the term post-traumatic growth, explained, "We see it in cancer survivors who discover new depths of courage and compassion. We see it in divorce survivors who learn to love themselves for the first time. We see it in refugees who develop unshakable gratitude for simple freedoms. Trauma can be destructive, but it can also be creative. It can burn away illusions and reveal truths that would never have been visible in ordinary circumstances." The mental health revolution of the 21st century has largely been based on Phoenix principles. Therapeutic modalities like cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness-based therapy, and trauma-informed therapy all work by helping people identify dysfunctional patterns, consciously kill those patterns, and develop healthier ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. The recovery movement for addiction operates on explicitly Phoenix-like principles. The 12-step programs require participants to admit that their old selves have become unmanageable, to surrender completely to a higher power, and to be reborn into a new way of life. The language is explicitly about death and resurrection. I was dead in my addiction, but now I am alive in my recovery. Contemporary neuroscience has discovered that Phoenix-like processes operate at the cellular level in the human brain. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself throughout life, is essentially a Phoenix mechanism. Old neural pathways die through disuse, while new pathways are born through repetition and attention. Every time we learn something new, part of our brain dies and is reborn in a new configuration. Dr. Norman Doidge, author of The Brain That Changes Itself, wrote, "The brain is like a phoenix that never stops burning and being reborn. Every moment, millions of neurons are dying and being replaced. Every experience literally rewrites your brain. You are not the same person who started reading this sentence, because the act of reading it has changed your neural structure. We are all constantly dying and being reborn at the microscopic level." This neuroplasticity research has revolutionized our understanding of human potential. It suggests that no one is permanently stuck in dysfunctional patterns, that the brain can heal from even severe trauma, that old dogs can indeed learn new tricks. The phoenix is not just a metaphor, it's an accurate description of how consciousness actually works. As we move deeper into the 21st century, the phoenix symbol continues to evolve and adapt, helping us navigate transformations that happen at unprecedented speed and scale. From the death and rebirth of entire industries to the resurrection of individual lives after personal catastrophe, the ancient bird continues to offer its timeless wisdom, that every ending contains the seeds of a new beginning, that destruction and creation are partners in the dance of existence, that death and rebirth are not opposite forces, but collaborating aspects of a single process. The phoenix has taught us that in a universe of constant change, the only constant is transformation itself. And perhaps that is the ultimate phoenix teaching, that we are not beings who occasionally transform, but rather transformation itself, temporarily taking the form of individual beings, always dying, always being reborn, always becoming something new. Epilogue. The eternal return as I sit here in the fading light of another day, writing the final words of this journey through 4 millennia of Phoenix mythology. I find myself thinking about the candle on my desk, how its flame is both constantly dying and constantly being reborn, each moment consuming itself to create the next moment of light. This, perhaps, is the phoenix's ultimate teaching. We have followed this mythical bird from the sacred temples of ancient Egypt, through the philosophical schools of Greece, the monasteries of medieval Europe, the alchemical laboratories of the Renaissance, the battlefields of the modern world, and into our own age of digital transformation. At every step, we have seen the same essential pattern: death giving birth to renewal, endings becoming beginnings, apparent destruction revealing itself as the deepest form of creation. But the phoenix is not just a story about transformation, it is transformation. It is not just a symbol of renewal, it is renewal itself, constantly adapting to new circumstances while maintaining its essential promise that nothing truly dies. Everything is merely transformed. In our contemporary world, we face phoenix moments at every scale. Individual lives are disrupted by divorce, illness, job loss, depression, the small deaths that clear the way for new possibilities. Communities are transformed by economic change, demographic shifts, natural disasters, collective, deaths that can become collective, rebirths. if we have the wisdom to recognize them as such. Our species faces perhaps the ultimate phoenix, challenge in the climate crisis, the potential death of the world as we have known it, and the birth of something unprecedented. The question is not whether transformation will come. It is already here. The question is whether we will participate consciously in our own rebirth or cling unconsciously to the dying past. The phoenix teaches us that the choice is always ours. Every moment offers the opportunity to die to who we were and be reborn as who we are becoming. Every crisis is potentially a chrysalis. Every ending is potentially a beginning. But the phoenix also teaches us that transformation cannot be forced or rushed. The aromatic nest must be carefully prepared. The fire must burn at the right temperature. The ashes must cool before the new bird can emerge. There is a rhythm to renewal, a timing to transformation that cannot be hurried. Perhaps this is why the phoenix myth has survived for 4,000 years, while so many other ancient stories have been forgotten. It speaks to something essential in the human experience, our deep intuition that life is not a straight line from birth to death, but a spiral of constant dying and becoming, a dance of destruction and creation that never ends. The Egyptian priests who first told the story of the Bennu bird understood something that we are only beginning to rediscover. That consciousness itself is phoenix-like, constantly consuming its own past to create its own future, always dying to what it was to become what it is becoming. Every time you let go of an old belief, an old identity, an old way of being in the world, you are participating in the phoenix mystery. Every time you choose growth over comfort, truth over familiarity, love over fear, you are building your own aromatic nest and lighting your own transformative fire. The phoenix is not just an ancient myth or a psychological metaphor. It is a practical technology for navigating change, a map for transforming suffering into wisdom, a promise that no matter how dark the night, no matter how complete the destruction, dawn will come, renewal will emerge, the phoenix will rise. In the end, that is all any of us can do. Tend our own inner fire, prepare our own aromatic nest, trust in the process of transformation that is always already happening, whether we are conscious of it or not. The phoenix does not ask us to understand the mystery of death and rebirth, only to participate in it with courage, wisdom, and hope. For we are all phoenix beings, dying and being reborn with every breath, every heartbeat, every thought. The fire of transformation burns within us always, waiting for us to surrender to its flames and discover what we are capable of becoming. The ancient story continues. The eternal return spirals onward. The phoenix rises now and always in you.